this again is another diagram which will give you a view of it. Like certain smaller countries which have achieved it, some who have pledged it but have not put it in law, some have put it in law and also in a policy document, and a lot of these African nations over here who have proposed it but are yet to sort of formalize it in many ways. And a fact from the book, I keep on adding these facts everywhere, which I feel are very relevant for you all to remember, which is exactly what these diagrams are saying. Net zero ambitions differ a lot across countries. So right from Finland to in India, and there are many beyond India also. But if you look at the most important ones, Finland, China, India, that's sort of the range in which they are hovering. Now, let's get into understanding the larger concept of how net zero is being looked at across countries, varying across. But there was then also a need to look at, okay, now we need to classify climate risk in certain simplified, understandable terms, because we can't wait till 2060 to do everything. We have to start understanding and implementing things from today itself. So that's where the role of TCFD came in 2017. If you remember the first slide introduction that we are talking about, it primarily helped classify the climate risk into two types of risk over here: physical risk and transition risk. And now moving forward, we'll be covering each one of these points in the slides coming forward. This is another important diagram. If I remember, this is there in the book itself, although I've written the source of UNPRI, but this is there in the updated 2025 book. It gives you a very good view of how TCFD sort of looked at defining the core elements of climate risk. And in fact, this is what the additional reading covers, then much more in detail, starting off from embedding climate risk in governance, then moving on to how the strategists in the business also are thinking about it, how the risk then around it is being managed from an ERM perspective, which is enterprise risk management, which is another element of the additional reading or the online reading that we have. And then finally having metrics and targets. So a lot of the metrics and targets, by the way, would be covered from chapter 6, 7 onwards. So this is sort of setting your framework and foundation for that. Again, create your own mental hooks to remember all of this, because a lot of time the exam can ask you specific questions on, the board is, for example, deciding to do this, so it will fall under which category. The moment you look at board, you should think of governance. So those are the kind of questions which will often also come differentiating between these categories. Now, when TCFD was sort of classifying this risk, they were primarily looking at key features in terms of how this risk should be. They tried to make it generic. That's why in some cases you'll see that maybe for my industry it's not looking specific, but they had to make it all encompassing in many ways. So again, adoptable by all organizations, had to be included in the financial filings. It could not be sort of segregated from it and be a standalone thing. That's what all of the organizations who are signing on to TCFD are also having. Then designed to solicit decision useful forward looking information, which is like the primary principle of how financial reports itself work out, which has been sort of translated into this also. And very importantly, strongly focused on RNO. So again, throughout the curriculum and throughout the chapter, we'll keep on talking mostly about risk. But remember, there is a concept of opportunities also. And in what SCR also often tests, they will not always ask you about just risk, but they'll throw in that spanner of what an opportunity could also look like. So there are a few slides also on that we'll cover. This again is from a Moody's report. If you see, TCFD started this in 2017. I just wanted to give you a view of how different companies by 2022 were reporting. And I just wanted to highlight three things just for you to get a sense of. So if you look at these four buckets between governance, strategy, risk, and metrics, the one which were least reported were between the resilience of the strategy and integration into risk management. So even the TCFT reports from 23 before it was disbanded clearly call this out as a very big gap area. You had very good embedding, for example, in the banking insurance industry, but equally very less of sort of reporting on different aspects when it came to the technology, media, and consumer good industry. So, very varied amounts of adoption. And as we read in the previous chapter, this has now finally been merged into the larger ISSB standard, which is coming out. So, hopefully, moving forward from the next few cohorts, we'll be talking less and less about TCFD, but more about ISSB S2 standard, which is actually the climate standard, which is literally what TCFD has gone in there. Now, the most important part, having known the why and hows of the net zeros and what TCFD did, this is where more of the conceptual questions now start being asked, which is what are the types of climate risk? Now, let's begin with the first one, which is physical risk. So, physical risk primarily arises from the literally the physical climate and the weather impacts that result from the changing climate. Now, what you need to understand here is the most important point, which is they result from hazards that are usually subdivided into acute and chronic hazards. Now, what are these acute and chronic hazards? You sort of now need to connect it to the weather and climate concept that you read in chapter one. It's there are all of these things are interconnected. So acute risk is that one time weather related incident which is sort of exacerbated by climate change, which is things like little event based things like floods, cyclones, and droughts. Then you have chronic risk, which is something which happens over a longer period of time. Again, as you see, now you're moving away from the concept of a weather more towards climate. Here, now you're looking at temperature risk, sea level rise, in terms of the larger aspects of water stress within the land areas also. So this is the primary difference, again, connecting back to the concept in chapter one between acute and chronic risk. Now, what is transition risk? Very clearly, sort of as a mental hook for all of you to remember, you have transition risk, which is associated with the risk in the economic transition or transformation, which leads to different cascade effects on the assets being sort of depleted or becoming stranded assets. That's the main concept that you've read about. Or eventually different policy or tech actions also, which are happening, which are reducing the possibilities of traditional technology and energy systems to sustain themselves. So it is a more, I would say, a multiple order and a systemic concept once you start coming to transition risk, where the physical risk aspect, as the name says, becomes literally the physical aspect. Now, what are the drivers of transition risk? There are many, and these are the types of transition risk that we'll ultimately cover. So it could be policy change, it could be regulatory changes, it could be technology changes, and we'll read about this, right? Despite not reducing subsidies on the renewable aspects of photovoltaic cells and EV batteries, the technology itself is improving by so much that now you don't need those subsidies in many ways, and the prices are falling down. And then, of course, we as consumers always creating pressure points, asking for more and more sustainable, healthier products. But now, when you sort of understand the larger aspect of physical and transition risk, one important point over here is that for both these kind of risks to manifest, hazards or the driving factors, so you look at physical hazards and driving factors for transition risk, are not alone. You need to look at them now from the perspective of exposure and vulnerability. Now, often a lot of us do get confused between hazards, exposures, and vulnerabilities. So I've put in a few examples. We'll get to it after this slide. But I wanted to quickly cover a concept which is there, by the way, in the ebook. So for those of you who have not yet read the ebook but are probably reading other things, there are a few videos which come in between the ebook in certain sections. And this was one of the brief 3 to 4 minute video that I found was very interesting, where Ben over here was talking about specific aspects of how different sectors are affected in a very different way. So now let me bring up the three main sectors here, which was talked about, right? One was agriculture, one was real estate and tourism. And in fact, in a lot of your examples that you'll see across the book, these sectors keep on coming up again and again. Agriculture primarily from the cascade effect that it has on inflation in general. With those of you who are economists or follow that space in general, you'll realize that, for example, food inflation in India has a very high component on the consumer price index, right? So the ripple effect is very huge. Same thing with real estate, because it's literally so much of real estate is present in those coastal areas. Those event-based floodings and incidents which happen has a very immediate impact on real estate as compared to other industries which might face the risk in a decadal basis. And then, of course, for the same reason, tourism, a lot of it which is connected to coral reefs in general, directly affecting the tourism revenues in many ways. So this section again sets that very good context of a few sectors that you need to think of it that way, in terms of which are more affected by physical risk. When we are covering transition risk, you'll also get a view on few sectors which are typical ones to be affected even more on transition risk. So we'll cover that over there.